Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, a Borderlands spin-off released on the 25th of March 2022, personifies the best and worst of the Borderlands franchise more so than any individual Borderlands game has. This game owes its existence in large part to one of Borderlands 2's best DLCs, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep. A more traditional fantasy experience based on the fictional version of Dungeons & Dragons, Bunkers and Badasses. This game, released 9 years after that DLC, takes the same premise and stretches it out into a full game that's bound to have many fans just on premise alone. In a Borderlands first, you can pick a class and design your character before jumping into this world and beginning your own adventure. Said adventure sends you on a quest to save the kingdom from the Dragon Lord and become your own hero. This being a Borderlands spin-off, hero in this context means wielder of many guns. Your character becomes the Fate Maker and is advised by Bunkers and Badass veterans Valentine and Fret, while Tina acts as Bunker Master. What's surprising for a premise that they've already done before is that the narrative here is inconsistent and seems to ebb and flow at a whim. When this game's story touches on moments of insecurity within Tina and how she uses Bunkers and Badasses to deal with her feelings, the narrative shines. When the story is left to take on the traditional save the kingdom fantasy plot, it starts to crumble, mostly under the weight of the writing's own insecurity. At every turn, the dialogue and text seem desperate to tell the player that it was aware that the player knew about an upcoming twist or event. To me, it felt like watching a movie with someone who'd already seen it before, and after every key story moment, they give you a nudge and a look that says, "I told you so." For example, you walk into a very obvious boss arena, and the game feels the need to point that out. Subverting the usual norms are clever tricks when done sparingly. There isn't a single bit of this game that takes itself seriously enough for long enough to establish anything of value other than the setup for a joke. There's little variation in the structure and delivery of these, which quickly dulls any humour you might have been able to find in them. These tricks are the exact same ones that were in Borderlands 2 and 3, and it really starts to grate on you after a while. There's a specific joke about Flotsam and Jetsam in the game that's been repeated 4 times. This isn't subtle genius. It's insecure hammering of a point to desperately ensure that everybody heard it. To use an analogy perhaps more appropriate with this title, jokes are best deployed like sniper fire, sparingly and with meticulous precision. The jokes here feel like someone loaded an SMG and was given a vague direction in which to point. The same writing fatigue is starting to take place with the breaking of the fourth wall too. This is a theme of many Gearbox games and has been implemented well previously. But here, you're playing a character within the Borderlands universe who's playing a character within a game of Bunkers and Badasses. There isn't a singular fourth wall being broken, there are several. While not complex or difficult to keep track of, the game oversaturates its narrative with these moments, once more dulling the effect of each one. This feels particularly overbearing if you're a veteran of the Borderlands games, as not only have you heard it all before, but the side quests and characters all feel like they were designed using the exact same template. Tina and her friends save the day by being genuinely likeable characters, and there are some actually surprising story moments. But more of this should have been played as a straight and narrow RPG, to really make the moments where the game subverts your expectations pop. Writing aside, the gameplay here is rock solid, and that counts for a lot. This mostly uses the Borderlands foundation and makes some fantasy tweaks. This begins with your player character, a fully customizable avatar, who can later pick up a subclass from any of the other classes that you didn't pick at the start. There are stats outside of skill trees, like strength, dexterity and intelligence, and usual D&D staples making appearances in the new hero rank skills. Spells enter the equation too, with grenades gone in favour of unique magics, and there's also new gear to further enhance your character, and a melee weapon slot. These changes are slight but effective, as they take the solid framework that works and works well, and successfully transposes it into a more familiar RPG character street. You are still stuck mostly with guns though, despite some of them being reskinned to look like bows or magic cannons. I do think this game would have benefited from disposing of guns altogether and using the Borderlands loot system to create an entirely new set of weapons, gear and equipment specific to this world. I do understand why the guns are here though, as that's a lot of assets to try and replace in such a small amount of time, and their presence doesn't hurt the game, they just make it less of a fantasy experience, and more like a Borderlands 3 DLC. I say that in an offhand kind of way, because I don't agree with the statement that much. This game is certainly more than DLC's worth, The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine notwithstanding. This game kinda gives off the same vibe as Borderlands the pre-sequel, where it tried out a lot of new mechanics like O2 and Zero G, but was ultimately little more than a dice roll away from Borderlands 2. The same could definitely be said here in regards to Borderlands 3. Progress takes you across the overworld and into dungeons, which are either short wave-based encounters or larger mapped areas that are instanced, like levels in the previous games. Although vehicles aren't present here, there are other methods of transport, such as streams of air and magic portals, and I never really missed having a car to ride around in. Every quest is level synced, so it doesn't matter if you've left a quest to sit in your log for half the game, as long as you go back and do it, you'll be rewarded with level appropriate gear. This removes the need to replay the campaign just to work your way to the level cap, and instead allows players to focus on acquiring the loot they want and trying out new builds and abilities. The praise is going to keep coming too, as it's time to look at Wonderlands' endgame. As a point of housekeeping, this game is shorter and in my opinion easier than Borderlands 3. It took me under 25 hours to see the credits roll, and in that time I'd hit 70% of all the completionist activities. The game's length doesn't hurt it too much, as it shows you into the endgame, which certainly has more legs than the vanilla Borderlands 3 one did. This starts with a fundamental redesign of loot tiering. Outside of the usual colour-based rarity system, which stops at orange, endgame loot now has two new classifications, chaotic and volatile. Chaotic loot can only drop in chaos mode. That's this game's mayhem mode equivalent. There are 20 stages of chaos to unlock, and to unlock the next one, you have to clear a roguelike-esque series of encounters, which pull from enemies and bosses that you fought throughout the story. Level 40 loot is now your baseline gear at the endgame, followed by chaotic, which is slightly more powerful and has stronger base stats. The path forward is then to use your normal level 40 gear to farm a chaotic version of your best in slot legendary. As you increase your chaos rank, you increase the drop rate for chaotic gear, which improves the chances of finding that legendary as a chaotic. Once you hit level 20 chaos, now hopefully equipped with a handful of chaotic gear, you can start to see volatile gear drop. As always, your aim is to get legendary versions of volatile gear, and this creates a bit of a gentler progression curve into the endgame, as it means the legendaries you've had are viable for longer. It does also mean that finding the volatile version of a specific legendary is quite difficult. Given that using these weapons and their crazy effects are a key part of this game's appeal, you can see why all these systems working together in this way create a strong and well-designed endgame experience that does show Gearbox learn from their previous mistakes. There are some areas here that I still expect Gearbox to improve or change, despite my praise. Moon Orbs and endgame currency are easy to acquire, but even easier to spend. The cap on these probably needs increasing. I made it to Chaos 19 before I really started to die in the endgame, and I still hadn't amassed enough gold to buy the maximum inventory size. I'd suspect that the sale value of some chaotic or volatile items might need tweaking to help combat heavily inflated upgrades. I also have questions over this game's longevity, just based on the gentle curve and current difficulty of the endgame, but these games never seem to lack in terms of DLC, events, or new loot that gets added, so I'm kind of just willing to put my faith in Gearbox here. Sort of like what I do with the Monster Hunter games, I just trust this type of game to eventually give me more if I go away and come back. In terms of graphics and performance, this both performs and looks like Borderlands 3. That should come as no surprise, as it's built using practically the same engine, for most of the same hardware, and it uses a chunk of the same assets. The only thing noticeably different was some of the particle effects. The effects in Wonderlands are flashier and denser, so I don't know if that's particularly better, but the game still ran at a rock solid FPS. I did keep this in the PS5's performance mode though, so do keep that in mind if you're comparing it to your own experience. Technically there were some glitches and bugs. I did get a handful of NPCs that adopted the T-pose as they moved during quests, and a handful of occasions where completing a trial run did not progress my chaos rank. There was also a single time where I got stuck in the floor of a boss arena and had to die to come unstuck. These are not awful bugs, and for the most part, quitting and reloading the game will solve them. I know exactly where I stand on the Borderlands games. Both the best and worst thing I can say about Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is that I stand in exactly the same place. When it comes to gameplay and mechanics, there's little to fault. The systems here make sense, provide avenues to distill power into your character, and complement the key driving force of the game, the search for loot. When it comes to other aspects, well, beauty really is in the eye of the beholder. I believe the writing is overbearing and laid on thick, and is only redeemed by a strong voice cast. As a result, this is definitely not a game I'm dying to replay immediately, but it is still a game I can see myself coming back to. So much of its predecessor's greatness are still ingrained into it, that there's no escaping that it has some appeal. It's surprisingly rare for a looter of any kind to launch with a competent system and vanilla endgame that feel valuable. Wonderlands did so successfully where many others have failed, but in turn, this can come across a little forced. Is this how much blood Gearbox could wring out of a concept like D&D and implant it into their own universe? If so, this definitely is lacking a little narratively. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is annoyingly great, and whether or not you lean more towards the annoying or the great part, both are present in the same game that's likely to come off a little bit better the fewer Gearbox games you played before.